All right, in 1981, two RPGs were released that would basically set the template for what RPGs would become. Those would be Ultima and Wizardry.
Right. Ultima and Wizardry, both released for home computers, both most closely associated, I think, with the Apple II. Here's what's important about that. Ultima plus Wizardry equals Dragon Quest. And Dragon Quest is really the progenitor of most modern RPGs on consoles.
The Ultima and Wizardry American games, Dragon Quest, the Japanese game.
It is surprising, though, how popular those games actually were in Japan. I mean, I remember as a kid, you know, there had been other first-person RPGs before then. If you've never seen old screenshots of Wizardry, it's you know, just line graphics. It's vector-based. You know, you got black walls, but it's one where you don't have any textures on anything, and a little picture will pop up of whatever creature that you're fighting. And it's funny to me too that you just have basically 3/4 of the screen is just UI, your character stats, you know, your basically your manual, your commands that you can do, and then just a little screen of graphics. But it was so immersive for the time, and it's just funny to me. That's what we kind of think of Western RPGs, but it's something that really did well in Japan, too.
Well, in '81, that was a feat of technical, forgive the pun, wizardry. I mean, these games people had been designing them on mainframes. College kids had played with these ideas in the '70s on mainframes, but these guys were doing this on home computers. That was just unthinkable that they were able to pull this stuff off. So, Ultima and Wizardry, two alternate takes, both on kind of the Dungeons and Dragons inspired role-playing game. One sort of a top-down, big, open world thing, and the Ultimate games kind of, they proceed through, and gradually the worlds just, as you go through the games, get bigger and bigger and more complex. And Wizardry, on the other hand, kind of the opposite. Not particularly story-driven like Ultima is, but instead a small, encapsulated area, first-person dungeon perspective, and you're just trying to hack, slash, and survive, very mechanically driven.
And again, like you said, these all came out of tabletop gaming.
Yeah.
This is what these guys did in their spare time, and they wanted to create something on the computer that represented what that was. Even Ultima, Richard Garriott, I think, started programming that in high school.
Yeah,
right?
oh yeah. He started with a Colabeth in high school, and that became Ultima. And and by the way, he did integrate some first-person stuff himself too. I know some people are probably taking note of that.
Stuff.
But by and large, it grew into a story-driven, map-driven series as time passed. And yeah, Garriott works on this at high school. The guys at Surtech, they do this very early on, and both series take off, but they both became well-known and popular enough in Japan, especially Wizardry, to eventually influence. Hey, how do we take this off? Just like they said, how do we take this off a mainframe and out of a book and put it onto a microcomputer? People in Japan said, how do we take this off a microcomputer and make it work on a console? And that's really where games like Black Onyx and then later, much more importantly, Dragon Quest come from.
You mentioned
turn-based combat.
You mentioned consoles. I ended up playing both these games on the NES when they were ported there some years later.
Yeah, so did I.
And I remember, you know, for me, who'd been raised on Super Mario Brothers, Zelda, Mega Man, these were a little too advanced for me. I couldn't really wrap my head around what Wizardry is trying to do.
Now, see, I started out playing these games on PC. You know, the Ultima series in particular, I played on an Apple II. And that was what role-playing games were for me. So when I ran into Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy, I was like, I know this. You know, it's kind of like the little girl in Jurassic Park. A Unix system. I know this. You know, I just jump right in, and it transitioned over really well. And actually, the streamlining for the most part was good for the series, or good for the progression of the games, not the series. My part.
You also played on Apple II.
My Apple II. That's mainly I duped my mom into getting a computer to play games on. Duped her into thinking that it was an educational tool. It really wasn't. Also, it was to play RPGs.
Also important to note that these games, in addition to the Dragon Quest influence in Japan, they also heavily influenced the development of PC RPGs. Things like Fallout, for example, have a genetic heritage that goes back to Ultima and Wizardry as well. And we shouldn't forget about that either. These were the games that influenced the guys that made those kinds of
and you even talk, I mean, you know, things like Bard's Tale, almost a direct you know, translation of Wizardry or a progression of Wizardry. You know, that same kind of perspective, even with better graphics, though.
To put it in perspective, the only video game developer that has ever been to outer space is the guy who made Ultima.
Yeah, that's actually true. And fitting, because in the original Ultima, there's like a space shooting sequence. Which is really
there's a lot of weird stuff in Ultima 1 and 2 in particular. It's really Ultima 3 that we see the party-based system come out, but Wizardry did parties earlier. Ultima did story earlier. You know, they progressed with it.
I think that's a good point, because that really speaks to Richard Garriott's passions, right? Which were fantasy and tabletop gaming and space.
I fully believe that more video game developers should go to space. That there's only one is a problem.
Should we leave any of them there?
We'll talk about that later.
Okay.